There is no better place to begin a course in philosophy than with the question, what is philosophy? Unfortunately, though, there are no bodies of knowledge for which there's less agreement about the very subject matter than philosophy. People who take up the study of biology, physics, or economics rarely debate what it is they're studying in the first place. Everyone agrees that biology is the study of living things, that physics is the study of the laws governing the physical world, and that economics is something like the study of money, markets, and wealth. But what exactly is philosophy? This is a much harder question to answer, but there is an answer. Perhaps we should begin with the precise meaning of the word philosophy, which comes from two Greek words, philia, which is one of the Greek words for love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. This is all well and good, but unfortunately, knowing that philosophy means the love of wisdom doesn't tell us very much about what philosophy actually is. After all, wisdom can be had about a great many things. The biologist has a certain wisdom about living things. The physicist has a certain wisdom about the laws governing the material universe. And the economist has a certain wisdom about money, markets, and wealth. But what one must ask is the philosopher's wisdom. What, in other words, is the philosopher wise about? Before I provide an answer to this admittedly difficult question, it's important to cast aside a major mistake or prejudice that many people today are in danger of making. Consider the following two groups of statements. Group A. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and the Earth, along with 8 other planets, revolves around the Sun. And now for Group B. It is morally wrong to kill an innocent human being. Money cannot make a person truly happy. And finally, God exists. When most people are asked to point out the major differences between the statements of Group A and the statements of Group B, they usually give some version of the same answer. Usually they'll say something like, Group A are facts and Group B are opinions, or Group A can be proven as true, whereas Group B cannot, or Group A count as science, whereas Group B are just matters of faith. When pressed a little further, most people will eventually explain that only the statements of Group A, and those like them, can be the subject of knowledge. Because they don't have anything to do with the subject matter of modern science, the statements of Group B, and those like them, cannot really be known. They can only be believed. To be sure, there is a fundamental difference between the statements of Group A and those of Group B. But for the purpose of coming to terms with philosophy, we must understand something very important. If it really is true that only statements like those of Group A can be known, philosophy is pointless. Why? For the simple reason that it's precisely philosophy that attempts to understand the kinds of things relevant to the statements of Group B, such as the difference between good and evil, the meaning of happiness, and the existence of God. Again, if such things simply cannot be the subject of any kind of knowledge, it follows that philosophy is nothing more than an exercise in frustration. If all we can do when faced with the great questions about God, morality, and human existence is to offer conjecture or blind opinion, there's little point in doing so. Why discuss, read about, or even think about questions concerning which there's no real knowledge to be had? Rather than wasting our time with values, why not just stick to provable and testable facts? Those who believe that human knowledge is limited to facts that can be scientifically verified subscribe to a school of thought known as scientism. And so, for scientism, philosophy should be eclipsed or replaced by science. Consider the following passage from the widely celebrated physicist Stephen Hawking. Quote, "How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Most of us do not spend most of our time worrying about these questions, but almost all of us worry about them some of the time. Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." End of quote. To understand Hawking's claim more precisely, philosophy is not only dead, it was never really alive in the first place. It never, in other words, really constituted knowledge. It was just all we had before science came along and liberated our minds. This belief lies at the very heart of scientism. And so we're given to ask, is this complete dismissal of philosophy justified? Can anything be said in philosophy's defense? For the remainder of this chapter, I intend to prove the following claim. Scientism and the dismissal of philosophy it entails is false, incoherent, and indefensible. Here's why. In order for scientism to be persuasive, one must accept the notion that all claims about reality may be divided into two categories, namely, those that can be empirically or scientifically verified or falsified, the statements like those of Group A, and those that cannot, the statements like those of Group B. There is, of course, nothing wrong with this distinction all by itself. Any reasonable person can accept it. The problem arises when the adherent of scientism further claims that only those statements subject to empirical verification or falsification may constitute knowledge. Why is this a problem? To answer this, we must observe that the proponent of scientism also makes a claim. And the claim is this: only scientifically verifiable facts, the adherent of scientism says, can be known. For simplicity's sake, let's label the claims about morality, happiness, and the existence of God as values. And so, scientism makes the following claim: facts can be known, values cannot. This is the essence of the worldview undergirded by scientism. This is also precisely why no clear-thinking person could ever accept that worldview. One must ask, is the claim, facts can be known, values cannot, itself a fact or a value? Immediately, the proponent of scientism will find himself or herself in a very uncomfortable position. If the claim, facts can be known, values cannot, is a fact, it must be empirically or scientifically verifiable. But how could one possibly subject that claim to such verification? Many proponents of scientism would begin by pointing out just how much disagreement there exists regarding values, whereas scientific facts are almost universally agreed upon once science has been allowed to do its work. But this is clearly a weak and ultimately irrelevant observation. To point out that there exists disagreement about something, even widespread disagreement, only shows that people disagree, not that the truth of the matter just can't be known. To be sure, there exist complicated mathematical truths that only those highly knowledgeable in mathematics can understand and thus know to be true. But the mere existence of disagreement does not for a moment lead one to think that such truths cannot be known at all. In the same way, the fact that people disagree about the immorality of abortion, the justice of democracy, or the existence of God does nothing to show that these things cannot be the subject of knowledge. Granted, such knowledge would be obtained in a very different way from the way we come to know scientific truths. But this does not mean that there might not be some other way of determining the truth about morality, justice, or the existence of God. In short, the problem is this. In order to show that empirical or scientific knowledge is the only kind of knowledge there is, the proponent of scientism must provide empirical or scientific evidence that scientific knowledge is the only kind of knowledge there is. But since no such scientific or empirical evidence is forthcoming, the case just falls apart. And this should come as no surprise. How could the claim that values cannot be known, when values are contrasted with empirical facts, be empirically or scientifically proven? The realm of the empirical, by definition, only deals with empirical things. This means it has no jurisdiction or expertise over claims or bodies of knowledge that fall outside the empirical. This is why a proponent of scientism who claims that values cannot be known really has no basis upon which to make such a claim, since, as he himself insists, values fall squarely outside the realm of science. The only way to be consistent with the idea that scientific knowledge is the only kind of knowledge there is to be silent on the matter of values, which of course includes refraining from the scientifically unverifiable claim that values cannot be known. One reaches the same conclusion, of course, even when the proponent of scientism finally admits that his central claim is not actually a fact at all, but rather a value. If the claim facts can be known and values cannot is a value, then the statement is obviously self-defeating and incoherent. This would be to admit that the central claim of scientism is itself unscientific and therefore unknowable. In the end, no matter what philosophical argument one gives in favor of scientism, that argument will always be self-refuting, since according to scientism, we should only allow ourselves to be persuaded by scientific arguments, not philosophical ones. Scientism is not merely a harmless mistake, and it has profound consequences for the shaping of modern culture. In his now famous encyclical letter, Faith and Reason, Pope St. John Paul II points this out explicitly. As he says, quote, "Another threat to be reckoned with is scientism. This is the philosophical notion which refuses to admit the validity of forms of knowledge other than those of the positive sciences, and it relegates religious, theological, ethical, and aesthetic knowledge to the realm of mere fantasy. Scientism consigns all that has to do with the question of the meaning of life to the realm of the irrational or imaginary. This leads to the impoverishment of human thought, which no longer addresses the ultimate problems which the human being has pondered constantly from the beginning of time." End of quote. To be clear, neither Pope John Paul II's criticism of scientism, nor my own, amounts in any way to a criticism of science itself. Modern science is one of the most admirable achievements of modern human beings. Nor is anyone claiming that philosophical knowledge is somehow superior to scientific knowledge. The only claim here is that modern science does not have a monopoly on knowledge, and to think it does is rationally indefensible, and even, as the late Pope argues so eloquently, potentially dangerous. Where does all this lead? Once he sees the falsehood and utter incoherence of the notion that scientific or empirical knowing is the only kind of knowing, even the most hardened skeptic must open himself up to the possibility that there might be other ways of knowing, other forms of knowing, such as we may call moral, metaphysical, or aesthetic knowledge. To reiterate, this knowledge, if it exists, and I intend to show that it does, will be acquired very differently from scientific knowledge. But this is hardly a justification for dismissing it as mere fantasy, or prejudicially excluding it from the realm of knowledge altogether. So, to be a philosopher is to pursue wisdom about the most fundamental questions of human life, such as the existence of God, the nature of human happiness, and the difference between good and evil. But to approach philosophy from a Thomistic perspective, we must narrow things down even further, since there is another science that seems to do this very same thing, namely theology. So what exactly is the difference between philosophy on the one hand and theology on the other? Fortunately for us, this is a question that Thomas Aquinas set out to answer at the very beginning of his most celebrated work, entitled the Summa Theologiae, which of course is Latin for the summary of theology. The very first question St. Thomas asks in this massive work is the following: whether, besides philosophy, any further doctrine is required. Speaking both as a philosopher and as a theologian, St. Thomas answers as follows, quote, "It was necessary for man's salvation that there should be a knowledge revealed by God besides philosophical science, built up by human reason. Firstly, indeed, because man is directed to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. But the end must first be known by men who are to direct their thoughts and actions to the end. Hence, it was necessary for the salvation of man that certain truths which exceed human reason should be made known to him by divine revelation. Even as regards those truths about God which human reason could have discovered, it was necessary that man should be taught by a divine revelation, because the truth about God such as reason could discover would only be known by a few, and that after a long time, and with the admixture of many errors. Whereas man's whole salvation, which is in God, depends upon the knowledge of this truth. Therefore, in order that the salvation of men might be brought about more fitly and more surely, it was necessary that they should be taught divine truths by divine revelation. It was therefore necessary that, besides philosophical science built up by human reason, there should be a sacred science learned through revelation." End of quote. What this passage shows us is that, from St. Thomas Aquinas' perspective, the difference between philosophy and theology does not really have so much to do with the subject matter of these two disciplines. In many respects, in fact, the subject matter of philosophy and theology is the same. Both the philosopher and the theologian study the nature of God, the basis of morality, and the purpose of human existence. The difference lies in how these essential questions are approached. The theologian, says Thomas, proceeds from truths that have been divinely revealed and attempts to derive further truths using human reason. The philosopher, considered solely as a philosopher, on the other hand, only derives knowledge from what can be known by the natural power of human reason alone. Thus understood, Plato and Aristotle were philosophers and only philosophers because they were entirely unaware of divine revelation, since they lived hundreds of years before Christ and had no knowledge of the chosen people's law or prophets. St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, for example, on the other hand, are both philosophers and theologians, because they bring to bear insights of human reason upon the truths of divine revelation. Now, in reading St. Thomas, things can get a little confusing, because sometimes he uses the word theology in a different and more literal sense. Of course, the word theology means the study of God, and therefore, so long as he's only relying on human reason, the philosopher can do a certain kind of theology in his own way. As we'll see more clearly in later lectures, knowledge about God can be gathered through strictly philosophical means. And so, when we're talking about this kind of theology, we might speak of natural theology, or to use the phrase that St. Thomas himself uses, that theology which is part of philosophy. Alternatively, when we're speaking about theology that rests upon divinely revealed truths, we might speak of sacred theology, or, as Aquinas puts it in the quotation just cited, sacred doctrine. The most crucial aspect of Thomas Aquinas' understanding of philosophy and theology is his insistence that between the two there is a fundamental harmony, which is also to say that there's a fundamental harmony between faith and reason. Why is this so? Well, for the simple reason that each of these has truth as its goal, and truth cannot contradict truth. To be sure, philosophers may claim to show by some argument that some aspect of the Catholic faith is false or unreasonable. But Catholic philosophers will know that all such arguments are somehow flawed, whether they immediately see those flaws or not. In the bold words of St. Thomas Aquinas, quote, "If our opponent believes nothing of divine revelation, there is no longer any means of proving the articles of faith by reasoning, but only of answering his objections, if he has any, against faith. Since faith rests upon infallible truth, and since the contrary of a truth can never be demonstrated, it is clear that the arguments brought against faith cannot be demonstrations, but are difficulties that can be answered." End of quote. And so in the Thomistic worldview, philosophy and theology go hand in hand. Aquinas would insist that, in many ways, theology sees farther than philosophy because it's based upon truths that are simply beyond human reason's ability to discover on its own, such as the doctrines of the Trinity or the Incarnation. At the same time, however, theology can be enhanced by the proper use of philosophy, since philosophy, done well, is able to explain or rationally clarify the truths of divine revelation. For example, one may learn from the Bible that God is just, but there does not exist a thematic discussion in the Bible as to what the nature of justice exactly is. Such a thematic discussion is the domain of the philosopher. Also, philosophy is able to refute the arguments of those who claim to show that certain aspects of divine revelation are false. So, even though philosophy cannot prove that God is three persons, for instance, philosophical reasoning can be used to show that such a teaching is not self-contradictory, impossible, or even unreasonable. Finally, philosophy can be used in the service of the Catholic faith to demonstrate what St. Thomas calls the preambles of faith. And the classic example of this would be philosophical arguments for the existence of God, which again we will examine later in detail. Interestingly, St. Thomas does not consider God's existence to be so much an article of faith itself, as it is a truth that reasonable people may come to know and upon which truths of revelation build. This again underscores a critical role for philosophy and philosophical reasoning in the pursuit of theological wisdom. In the lectures that follow, we will have the opportunity to explore some of the key philosophical insights and arguments upon which the Thomistic worldview is based, covering such important subjects as the existence of God, human nature, and morality. By the end, it should be abundantly clear that Thomism is not some relic of the past that's of interest solely for antiquarian or historical reasons, but a philosophically compelling worldview even now in the 21st century, capable of defending itself against its fiercest critics and leading us to the truth about God, the world, and ourselves. I hope you're looking forward to this as much as I am.